Right now, as you watch this, oil tankers are crossing the Indian Ocean loaded with crude, and the payments being made for that oil are not going through New York. They're not clearing in dollars. They're settling in a currency that 20 years ago nobody would have seriously suggested could challenge the greenback. And the wild part? The system that made the US dollar untouchable for half a century, the system that let America borrow unlimited money, run endless deficits, and still keep the world's most powerful currency. That system was always built on a single quiet agreement. Not a treaty, not a law, a handshake deal in the desert. And that deal is quietly, slowly, irreversibly coming apart. This isn't a prediction. This isn't a conspiracy theory. The evidence is sitting in shipping ledgers, central bank reserve disclosures, and bilateral trade agreements that most people never read. So today we're going to read them. And by the end of this, the way you look at your savings, your economy, and the next decade of global power is going to be different. Let's go. To understand what's breaking, you first have to understand what was built. Imagine you're running a country in 1971. You've been fighting a war for a decade that's bleeding you dry. Your government is spending more than it earns. And the countries you owe money to, France, Germany, Britain, are starting to show up at your door and saying, "We'd like our gold back, please." That was America. And President Nixon made a choice that reshaped the entire global financial order. He took the dollar off gold. Just like that, the currency that half the world had been trusting since 1944 was suddenly backed by nothing tangible, just faith, just the word of a government running a deficit. Most economists at the time expected the dollar to collapse. And honestly, by all logic, it should have. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because 2 years later, a small team of American diplomats flew to the Middle East and made a deal that nobody fully announced, nobody voted on, and almost nobody understood at the time, but that quietly became the most consequential financial arrangement since the invention of central banking. The deal was simple on the surface. Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, would sell every single barrel of its oil in US dollars. Not in gold, not in pounds, not in any other currency. Only dollars. In exchange, America would offer something the Saudi royal family valued even more than currency: protection, military hardware, a security umbrella. And crucially, Saudi Arabia would take those oil revenues and park them right back into US Treasury bonds. Think about the elegance of that loop for a moment. Really sit with it. Every country on earth needs energy to function. Every country that needs energy now needs dollars to buy it. To get dollars, they export goods, hold US bonds, or run their central bank reserves in American currency. And all that money flows back to Washington in the form of cheap borrowing costs and structural global demand for the greenback. The dollar wasn't backed by gold anymore. It was backed by oil, and oil was backed by the US Navy. That's the petrodollar, not a formal institution, not a treaty you can look up in international law, just an arrangement, elegant, enforced, and for 50 years, seemingly permanent. From the late 1970s through the early 2000s, the petrodollar didn't just work. It made America something that had never existed before in economic history, a country that could run deficits indefinitely and still maintain the world's strongest currency. Here's an analogy that might help. Imagine a coffee shop where the only currency accepted is a token that only you print. Everyone in town wants coffee, so everyone needs your token. You can print more tokens to pay your rent, your staff, your debts, and as long as people keep wanting coffee, those tokens hold value. The coffee is oil. The token is the dollar. West Germany ran this loop. Japan ran this loop. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, every export-driven economy in the world sold goods to America, earned dollars, needed to buy oil, used those dollars, and parked the rest in treasury bonds. It was self-reinforcing, almost self-perpetuating. And if you tried to break out of the loop, the consequences were stark. In the early 2000s, a Middle Eastern leader quietly began pricing a portion of his country's oil exports in euros. He thought it was a reasonable economic decision. Within a few years, his country had been invaded, his government dissolved, and the euro-denominated oil pricing had ended. I'm not saying the oil pricing caused the war. History is never that clean. But the timing was noted, quietly, carefully, by every oil-producing government on earth. The message was clear: The petrodollar had teeth, economic teeth and military ones. For decades, no one seriously challenged this, not because they didn't want to, because they couldn't afford to, but something was quietly changing, and it had nothing to do with ideology or geopolitics or even resentment of American power. It had to do with math, and one number specifically. In 2015, for the first time in the petrodollar era, China imported more crude oil than the United States. Let that sit for a second. The entire architecture of the petrodollar was built on the assumption that the world's largest energy buyer was also the world's largest economy, and that economy ran on dollars. But now, the world's largest energy buyer was a country with its own currency, its own financial ambitions, and, critically, every strategic reason in the world to reduce its exposure to American monetary policy. Put yourself in Beijing's position for a moment. Every barrel of oil you import, you pay for in dollars. That means you have to hold hundreds of billions of dollars in reserve, money that can be frozen if Washington decides it doesn't like your behavior. That's not paranoia, by the way. That's recent history. In 2022, the US and its allies froze roughly $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves almost overnight. China watched that happen and drew a very clear conclusion. So China started building an exit. Not a dramatic public announcement, not a press conference, just quiet, methodical infrastructure. In 2014, they launched an international payment system called CPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. Think of it as a parallel plumbing system to SWIFT, the Western-controlled messaging network that routes most international bank transfers. Transactions through CIPS don't appear in SWIFT data. If you're only reading SWIFT reports, you're already missing a significant share of global trade flows. Then they opened a yuan-denominated oil futures contract in Shanghai. Low volume at first, barely noticed, but it was a signal, and the people who needed to understand that signal understood it immediately. Then came the conversations with Riyadh. For 40 years, the idea that Saudi Arabia would price oil in anything other than dollars was almost unthinkable. The deal made in the 1970s wasn't just economic, it was existential. American protection was the reason the House of Saud still held power. But something began to shift, not in the oil fields, but in the relationship itself. Washington began reducing its military footprint in the Middle East. The shale revolution meant America was producing its own oil at scale, making it less dependent on Gulf imports. And political tensions over Iran policy, over arms sales, over human rights pressure, began to fray the trust that had held the arrangement together for half a century. Meanwhile, China was offering something America wasn't: commercial partnership with no strings attached, no lectures, no conditions, just contracts. By 2023, a portion of Saudi Aramco's oil sales to Chinese buyers were reportedly being settled in yuan. The exact percentage is difficult to confirm. Saudi Arabia doesn't publish a breakdown deliberately. They have no interest in publicly poking Washington. But the shift is visible in China's yuan usage data, in the volumes going through the Abu Dhabi Yuan clearinghouse that opened in 2023, and in the quiet acknowledgement from multiple Gulf financial officials speaking off the record. The UAE went further. They built clearing infrastructure, the operational backbone for settling oil trades in yuan across the region. That's not symbolic. You don't build financial infrastructure for transactions you're not planning to do. Iraq signed oil for infrastructure agreements with China, denominated in yuan. Pakistan began exploring rupee-yuan bilateral energy trades. Even Brazil, the world's 8th largest economy, signed currency swap arrangements with China to facilitate direct yuan-real trade. None of these individually breaks the dollar, but collectively, they represent something the petrodollar has never faced before: a deliberate, coordinated, multi-country effort to build an alternative architecture, not to destroy the dollar, just to need it less. And needing it less, it turns out, is just as dangerous for American financial dominance as replacing it entirely. Here's where I want to be honest with you about something. This story gets sensationalized a lot. You'll find YouTube videos telling you the dollar collapses next Tuesday. You'll find financial newsletters screaming about imminent catastrophe. That's not what we're doing here, because the actual mechanics of this shift are more subtle and in some ways more consequential then a dramatic crash. The dollar's power doesn't come from people choosing it consciously. It comes from structural demand. Countries hold dollars because they need dollars to buy oil. Central banks keep dollar reserves because their own currencies are priced relative to the dollar. The whole system creates demand that exists independent of anyone's preferences. When you reduce the percentage of global oil trade that requires dollars, you reduce that structural demand. And when structural demand falls, the math on American borrowing starts to change. Here's a concrete way to think about it. The US government currently carries debt north of $33 trillion. It pays interest on that debt. The interest rate it pays is low, historically speaking, because global demand for treasury bonds keeps yields suppressed. That's a direct gift from the petrodollar. Countries accumulate dollars, they park them in treasuries, demand stays high, rates stay low. Now imagine 25% of oil trade moves out of dollars. Central banks gradually rebalance. Dollar reserves shrink from 60% of global holdings toward 50%, then 45%. Treasury demand softens. Yields drift upward. The US government's interest bill climbs, not catastrophically, not overnight, but steadily. And at 33 trillion in debt, even a 1 percentage point rise in average rates means hundreds of billions more in annual interest payments. The Federal Reserve then faces a choice it's never had to face in the petrodollar era. Let rates rise and choke the economy, or print money to cover the gap and accept inflation? Either path has consequences, and those consequences land on ordinary people first. The person whose savings are in cash, the family whose purchasing power quietly erodes, the worker whose wages don't keep pace with the price of imported goods. These aren't abstractions. This is how reserve currency transitions actually feel from the inside, not like a sudden earthquake, but like a slow, grinding change in the cost of everything. As of early 2026, credible estimates suggest roughly 15 to 20% of global oil trade is settling outside the dollar system. In 2019, that number was under 5%. That trajectory is the story. There's a historical parallel here that almost nobody talks about, and it's the most important one. In 1900, the British pound was the world's reserve currency. Britain ran the largest empire in history. Sterling dominated global trade. London was the center of global finance. Sound familiar? By 1956, the pound was finished as a global reserve currency, not because Britain lost a war, not because of a financial crash, but because the structural conditions that made sterling dominant, empire, trade monopoly, naval supremacy, had slowly eroded. And when the Suez Crisis hit, it exposed just how hollow the edifice had become. The US refused to support Britain financially. Sterling collapsed under pressure, and the transition that had been building for decades completed itself in months. The people who saw it coming, the ones who had been quietly diversifying out of sterling assets since the late 1940s, were fine. The ones who held on because the pound has always recovered were not. That's the lesson. Reserve currency transitions are slow until they're fast. Decades of erosion, then a moment where the whole thing reprices. We don't know when that moment comes for the dollar. Maybe 2028, maybe 2032. Maybe the system stabilizes and we get a multipolar currency world that unfolds gradually over 20 years. But the direction of travel is not ambiguous. It's visible in the data, in the infrastructure, in the bilateral deals, and in the behavior of the institutions, central banks, sovereign wealth funds, state oil companies that move first and move quietly. I want to end this with something grounded, because if the framing of this video is panic and buy gold, then I've done you a disservice. Here's the honest version. First, the dollar is not going away, not in your lifetime. It will remain a major global currency. But there's a meaningful difference between being the world's dominant reserve currency and being one important currency among several. That difference determines how much the US can borrow, at what cost, and how much inflation Americans are insulated from. Losing that distinction has real consequences for real people. Second, central banks are already voting with their reserves. Global central bank gold purchases hit record highs in 2022 and 2023. That's not coincidence. Institutions that hold trillions in reserves don't buy gold because they like shiny objects. They buy it because they're reducing exposure to assets that can be frozen, devalued, or politically weaponized. Third, diversification isn't speculation, it's just geography. If the global economic center of gravity is shifting east, having zero exposure to non-dollar economies is a concentration risk. That doesn't mean abandoning US markets. It means not being 100% dependent on a single currency system at a moment of structural transition. And finally, timing matters, not in a sell everything today sense, but in the sense that the window for repositioning before mainstream awareness catches up is finite. When the transition becomes obvious to everyone, asset prices will already reflect it. The petrodollar was built in a moment of crisis by people who saw an opportunity that others missed. Understanding what's happening now, before it's on the front page, is exactly that same kind of clarity. Watch the non-dollar oil trade percentage, watch central bank gold accumulation, watch CIPS transaction volumes, watch whether the Gulf states deepen or pull back their yuan settlement infrastructure. Those are the real indicators, not the headline, not the noise. The system that's changing is one of the most important ever built, and it's changing in plain sight, quietly, one contract at a time. There's one piece of this story we haven't touched yet, and it might be the most consequential part of all. Because the petrodollar was always enforced by something beyond economics. It was enforced by military reality, the idea that the US could and would respond to challenges to dollar dominance with force. But what happens when that military deterrent itself becomes stretched, when the countries building alternative systems are also the world's largest manufacturers of the components that modern militaries run on? That's a different video, and it changes everything we've just discussed. If you want to go there, subscribe. That's the next thread we pull. And if this gave you something to think about, something you hadn't seen framed this way before, drop a comment. Tell me where you think this ends up, because I genuinely want to know what you think. The clock is running. The question is whether you're watching it.